But here we are, identity politics and the doctrine of the image of God. There was an incident during the recent election campaign, which I'm sure most of you will have noticed and remember, when during a radio phone-in, a member of the public asked the then Lib Dem leader Joe Swinson this, quote, "Please can you tell me what a woman is," unquote. Now, until recently, a relatively straightforward question, but one to which Joe Swinson struggled to offer a straightforward answer. And it went like this: a pause. Then, quote, "I know I am a woman, and I think we know what we are." That's the answer. She then shifted the next answer in the next sentence onto women's rights, and to bracket women's rights in all of one sentence with all of the following words: black, Asian, white, gay, straight, bi, privileged, cis, trans, disability. A record, surely. But the questioner, who seemed a very reasonable lady, Kathy from Swindon, I think, or somewhere, attempted to bring her back to the question, which was one of definition, but without success. Now, let me say, I have no doubts about Joe Swinson's good intentions here, and no comments on her politics, but let me make three brief observations that I think this brief encounter highlight for us. First, we today are witnessing a revolution in self-understanding with as yet unclear and undetermined consequences. This appears to be part of a longer term but ongoing shift from the interdependent self to the independent self, a self which derives its identity only from its own inner attributes. And crucially, where these inner attributes conflict with external reality, it is now reality that must be changed and not the self. The self is sovereign. The term I identify as has become one of the defining features of our age. That's first. Second, those who question or resist the sovereignty of the self, understood and expressed in this way, are perceived as inherently oppressive, as violating our human rights and causing us harm. So identities are pitted against one another in a struggle for freedom and justice. That is why Swinson segues very quickly the reference to black, Asian, gay, cis, trans, and so on. Identity has become the prism through which we seek to make the world a better place. Third, given that one of the duties of the state is to protect its citizens from harm, then the state may have an interest in regulating the ways in which these categories are defined and understood so as to defend those most at risk. That's why this is addressed to a politician. Hence, the politics of human labeling, of human identity, or, as it's more commonly known, identity politics. So the question for us together this morning is, how do we approach this whole contentious area with a Christian mind? And we shall barely scratch the surface. I'll be raising more questions than I answer. But before we get started, let's be honest and recognize for the vast majority of us here, the answer to that question, well, how should we address it, is we'd rather not. Thank you very much. Let's hope some fool of an elderly, tired professor will take it on. Why the reluctance? It's obvious, isn't it? Because in this sphere, a badly worded statement, a study perceived as having produced the wrong finding, anything we do or say which can be construed out of context as promoting the cause of the oppressor labels us as the oppressor, and therefore an enemy to be defeated. The result of all this is the chilling of free speech and the closing of the academic mind and the editing of Christian apologetics such that we gravitate constantly toward what I call the old apologetics of science, faith, suffering, the textual validity of the scriptures. These are well understood, well worn, but there's a whole world of new apologetic challenge out there which is being closed down through the fear of people like us in the academic sphere. A study reported actually just this week in the Atlantic confirms, a US study, that whilst on the one hand the majority of US undergraduates support the concept of viewpoint diversity in principle in academic life, fully 2/3 of those with socially conservative views censored themselves from expressing those views in the classroom, even where directly related to the topic, the subject under discussion. And here's the surprising thing, along with 49% of what might be viewed as moderates. And the authors point out that it's the free expression of unpopular ideas that allows blind spots to be revealed and all sides to move forward to a better understanding of the truth of things. But where a substantial proportion of a class fear social sanction, including the fear that peers would file a complaint against them, the whole educational task is put at risk. And of course, Christian students and academics face a double jeopardy here, in that regardless of their particular views, in the cultural drama we all inhabit, our role is pre-assigned. We are the villain. So if we were watching a pantomime, the Christian is the villain. Every word, every action is scrutinized until she says or does something that allows her true motives to be revealed, the oppressor. And of course, there are understandable reasons for this cultural stereotyping. The history of the Christian church is littered with examples of oppression of women, support for slavery, exclusion and persecution of those who dare express a dissonant view. So this cultural narrative is not without its validity, some validity. So given the contentious nature of this, the potentially traumatic consequences becoming involved, the way in which one's career may be put at risk by a misplaced word, we prefer to keep our heads down. But here's the challenge, friends. I suggest that aside from the intellectual cowardice here, and yes, we need wisdom, enormous wisdom, but aside, and it is for older academics like me, like Elaine and others, to take some of the hit, I think. It is, isn't it? I think it's a role that we inhabit. But even so, we shouldn't be the only ones, because there is an intellectual cowardice here. And if we don't address these topics, I'm afraid they will address us. That's the issue at stake here. Let me give you an example. I went along a little while back to an apologetic/evangelistic event in the City of London, organized by a group of Christians. And it was billed as evidence for the resurrection explained by a top lawyer. And along came a bunch of people, a lot of non-Christians there, to hear the evidence for the resurrection set out by a top lawyer. And in a top lawyerly way, he set out the evidence in great detail and distributed copies of 1 Corinthians 15 all around the room, which we followed very carefully. And it was an interesting apologetic. And then we came to questions. Not one question referred to anything that he just said. People immediately segued to a post-modern mindset. Well, of course, you know, you would marshal the evidence, you would retrofit it to your own beliefs, because you want it to be true. You want Jesus to have risen from the dead. So, you know, you brought a set of evidence, but who knows, next week we could hear someone with a completely set of evidence. What can we rely on? But then we moved very unquick. But anyway, Christian faith that you're an ambassador for? What about the history of oppression? What about gay marriage? Can you help us with, to tell us, what are your views on gay marriage? So my point is that we can keep our heads down, but if we don't engage these issues, they will engage us at some point. So rising to the challenge and returning to our question, how should we respond? And I suggest first by paying as much attention to the process, that is to our mode of engagement, as to its content. Okay? And I want to take these two in turn, that we pay attention to the mode, to the way in which we engage with this, as much as to the content. And this, I'm going to ask for some patience from those who are keen to get on to the ideas, because I think this is important, and I'm going to take a little time over it. Process. You see, Christians generally tend, when they do get involved in this area, to default far too readily to the posture of culture war. Defensive, combative, focused on winning arguments rather than people. And far too early in the conversation, we find ourselves talking about who can use women's bathrooms, or whether bakers should be compelled to decorate cakes with words that conflict with their own beliefs. And our posture is combative. And I'm not saying that these are not important issues. And of course, it's difficult because they're the issues that are brought to us as the presenting issue. I'm not saying there are simple answers. They are important issues. The problem is that this posture encourages binary arguments, it promotes tribalism, and it heightens division. This posture tightens what I call bonded relationships with my group, and what we need are bridging relationships with other groups. They underscore our common enemy rather than open up our common humanity. So I'm here to argue that whatever the issue in play, whether it's feminism, transgender, race, or class, we take intentional steps to find the common ground. And as it happens, I contest in the field of identity politics, this should not be too difficult. Christians have a great deal of common ground with those who desire to fight oppression. Indeed, when Mary learned that she would bear the Savior of the world, she portrayed the implications of that moment, that momentous event, in terms of freedom from oppression. Remember? He has brought down the rulers from their thrones. This young girl squares herself up against Herod, the Roman Empire, but he's lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but he has sent the rich empty away. The language of fighting oppression, fighting injustice is our language. Why do we cede this to the other side? So let's engage by highlighting our shared goals and desire for the common good. Not simply because it's the smart thing to do, because it subverts the narrative. It's the right thing to do. Of course, we're not naive. We recognize that other factors are in play here besides good intentions on all sides of the argument. There are good intentions on all sides of the argument. But we recognize other factors are in play as well. In his recent book, The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray argues that following the collapse of the old grand narratives, first religion, then the secular hopes of post-Enlightenment modernism, today's identity battles, the ever fiercer campaigns, the ever more niche demands, simply for many people, give life the meaning they crave. They're not particularly well intended. They're not actually filled with a desire for social justice, to see the poor raised up and the mighty cast down. This, for them, is a meaning in life. It gives them something to do, and I don't think that is an entirely cynical analysis. But not all people Similarly, we're not naive. For some, there are darker forces in play. This isn't only a struggle to defeat the oppressor. For some, in the style of Orwell's Animal Farm, this is a desire to take over his role. Multiple factors in play. We are not naive. But that shouldn't prevent us recognizing that many people are swept up into these ideas simply because they want to do the right thing. They want to see the little people raised up, and they don't want to see the poor people neglected and pushed out. And we have much common ground with them. And so first, we pay attention to process, to our posture. But then second, we pay attention to content, to the ideas that are in play. You see, identity politics pivots around the central question of what it means to be a human being. And this is the arena in which we must pursue lively, informed, intellectual debate. And what could this look like? Well, first, there are many ways of engaging at this point. But first, we could start by asking, how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And our analysis might go something like this. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor traces the history of identity by drawing a contrast between human self-understanding pre-Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment. Pre-Enlightenment, the question of identity was not an issue, really, he argues. There was a givenness to life. And this offered a certain confidence to the self. I am a baker. I am a mother. I am a Frenchman. And to the declaration of the self, I am, not I identify as, which has with it the notion of contingency. I identify as today. No, I am conveys a sense of stability, of rootedness, and a confidence about the self. Now, of course, this was for better and worse, conceded. But nevertheless, that's his analysis of the pre-Enlightenment self. Now, this changes with the Enlightenment. Now, identity isn't something we derive from a common nature or an inherited status, but rather the product of an individual's own quest for self-understanding. Taylor calls this transition the monological turn in the construction of human identity. People encouraged to look within themselves and talk with themselves in order to discover their true or inner self, and then to live authentically with who they are. The monological turn. You may have heard of the sociologist Robert Bellah. I think you'll certainly have heard of the term he coined, expressive individualism. It was in his 1980s book, Habits of the Heart. 1982, I think it was. Surveying the history of individualism, and particularly focused on Alexis de Tocqueville, who Bellah says coined that word, and I think that's right, in the 19th century. Bellah argues that the spirit of self-reliance at the heart of the American project meant that it was my duty, not somebody else's duty, but my individual duty to go out and make something of the world for myself and my family. This was commented on by Alexis de Tocqueville, who was intrigued by the American spirit and the spirit of the founding fathers. And it was this great spirit of self-reliance which de Tocqueville argued underlay individualism. The individualism that characterized emerging American culture. And Bellah calls that utilitarian individualism because it is my responsibility, not the state, to make something of our lives, of my family, of our children. But then, with the advent of modern psychology in the late 19th century and the emergence of therapy culture through into the 20th century, Bellah suggests a new form of individualism arose, which is a development of utilitarian individualism. expressive individualism. In expressive individualism, it's not only my duty to make something of the world, it is now my duty to make something of myself. Self-fulfillment, self-esteem. The self esteems, accords itself its own worth, its own dignity. I am my own experiment. I am my own work of art, sings Madonna. And of course today, witness Madonna, expressive individualism is everywhere around us. Everywhere, isn't it? Every Disney movie. But, and I think this is a big but, why then the rise of identity politics? If self-acceptance, self-esteem is the route to human flourishing, why then does the self, today's self, appear still yet more vulnerable, more fragile, constantly at risk, constantly dependent on a slight, a comment from somebody else for its own sense of well-being? Rather than the non-contingent self, standing on the sure and solid foundations of its own self-affirmation, this is a vulnerable, contingent self, constantly at risk on your comment about me. Why is this? Why do we need to fight oppression with such fervor, employing such aggression, settling for nothing less than the destruction of our opponents, when we should be feeling so confident about ourselves? Well, for the simple reason that self-esteem, self-identification doesn't work. Taylor argues that to understand themselves, human beings need some reference point outside of themselves. Without it, there is always more to be discovered. You're never sure that I've left something out, something left within to be uncovered, to be accepted, to be developed. You can never be sure that you're enough. And so, Taylor says, you are driven back to look outside of yourself, seeking, nay, demanding affirmation from others, what he then calls the dialogical term. Now, the spectacular failure of the self-esteem movement, I think, bears witness to the inability of the self to affirm itself in this way. Let me tell you about the work of Joanna Woods, University of Hamilton, Ontario. She carried out a beautiful randomized study, and I'll just give you one small part of it. She took a group, it's always students, never volunteer for a psychology experiment. It's never quite what it seems. But she took a group of students and randomly allocated them to one of three groups. I'll tell you about two of the groups. She gave one of the groups a bunch of these cards of self-affirmation. I'm special. I'm charged with confidence. I enter a room and my sense of magnetic energy infuses all around me. No? I'm trying it, but it's... so she... You can download these a pack of cards, and from the American Self-Esteem Association to this day. And she gives people these self-affirming statements. And the aim of the project is, does this work? Does using these statements really do the job of providing the foundations that we need? And the other group, and so what they're instructed to do was to take these statements and meditate on them positively, appropriating their truth for 20, 30 minutes every day. Every day. It's a kind of a little selfie quiet time, you might say. And then at the end of 3 months and 6 months, we compare the outcome with the second group, who were told to meditate on these cards, but to ask the question, how much is this true? How much is this not true of me? Okay? Now, what happens when we follow the group up at 3 and 6 months? We've carried out a battery of psychological tests at the beginning of the study. Now we repeat them at 3, 6 months. Well, very briefly in a nutshell, the people who had a low view of themselves, low self-esteem, at the beginning of the study, in group 1, who got the self-affirming statements felt worse about themselves at the end. It's a very interesting study. And Woods concludes, she said, these self-affirming statements, which are used so widely in culture still, particularly North American culture, but she said these self-affirming statements seem to work for those who don't really need them, already feel pretty good about themselves. So, for example, Donald Trump would have a good time with these statements. And these are her, Joanna Wood's words, but they backfire for the people who need them most. Why? Because it's just your own propaganda. And the question this raises for us, if the self has such difficulty affirming its own worth, how much more its own meaning, its own nature? In the words of Matt Crawford, popular philosopher, his book, The World Beyond Your Head, you probably know, wonderful book in my view, but Matt Crawford calls this project of self-affirmation, it is an heroic project of open-ended, ultimately groundless self-making, and it is doomed. So, unable to give the recognition we crave to ourselves, we're driven back outside of ourselves to demand it from those around us. And in his well-known Sunday Times bestseller, Identity, Politics and the Struggle for Recognition, Francis Fukuyama notes how the philosopher Hegel argued that the struggle for recognition was the ultimate driver of human history in his view. The struggle for recognition, a force that is the key to understanding the emergence of the modern world. And then Fukuyama goes on to say, because human beings naturally crave recognition, the modern sense of identity evolves quickly into identity politics. A politics where individuals demand recognition of their worth. It is their right. It is their human right. And we might add, on their terms, in their chosen categories, and in a way which affirms and never challenges the sovereignty of the self. So with this analysis in mind, what does the specifically Christian mind have to offer as we move toward our conclusion? What I suggest we have to offer is the doctrine of human made in the image of God. A doctrine which has underpinned the Western concept of human rights. I was listening to John, not only this morning, but a couple of nights ago, saying, isn't it extraordinary that a newborn, 26-week-old, newborn, brain damage that you hold in your hands, helpless, because of this doctrine is viewed to have the same dignity and worth as the President of the United States. What an extraordinary gift that this doctrine is to our human understanding. A doctrine, of course, which catalyzed amongst the early Christians an opposition to expositio, where you could leave your unwanted children out. And the pagans looked in, as Philip Stark says in his Rise of Christianity, as he attempts to understand how the Christian church grew so quickly. He says the pagans looked in and they noticed how that they had the same number of little girls as little boys amongst Christians. And they realized that they had something that they wanted, the pagans. And that's part of the story. And so we have to offer this wonderful doctrine of human made in the image of God. It's wonderful rights, but further responsibilities. Responsibilities as bearers of God's own image to defeat injustice, to fight injustice, to care for God's world, to be creative, inventive, artistic, as He is all of these things. So I just want to finish by suggesting 4 final implications that to get the juices flowing. First, this doctrine insists that we shift the terms of the debate from common enemy to common humanity. We must not other our opponent, for they too bear the image of God, spoiled as it is by the fall, but still of unique value in his sight. So, as John quoted earlier, we stand ready to make a defense of the hope that is within us, but always with gentleness and respect, because of those to whom we speak. Second, this provides extraordinarily fertile opportunities for finding common ground. It is not only our human rights that the doctrine of the image of God gives us, but it confers responsibilities toward the poor, the marginalized, those who are neglected and pushed out and oppressed. Third, it provides a God-given framework for self-understanding. In Christian belief, the true nature of the self is not discovered inside the self, nor constructed by the self. It is revealed to the self. And here is the point of reference we crave. Fourth, I say framework because the subjective experience of being made in the image of God, of being the image of God, is of course a dynamic experience. It's not written down as a set of rules which we simply remember. It is a lived experience. In Genesis chapter 1 that I think Matt referred to earlier, we read, then, let me read, Genesis 1, 26, 27, just to remind us. Then God said, let us make mankind, humankind, in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. And I suggest that from these verses, linked with other scriptures, being made in the image of God implies a dynamic subjectivity, because clearly it is both a given and a mandate, a limitation and a freedom. The doctrine sets creaturely limits upon what we are and who we are, as well as extraordinary possibilities for who we will become. In that sense, it's a framework. In fact, the weight of scholarly opinion, I think now, looking at the limitations, points us to the bodily nature of this image bearing. The Hebrew word selem, for instance, basically means physical, quote, carved or hewn statue or copy of a non-physical being. In the case of Genesis 1 of Yahweh. This framework argues strongly, therefore, against the right to self-identification, self-definition, the autonomous self. It imposes limitations, the limitations of creaturely physicality, for one. But you see, limitations, I suggest, are not a curse, but a blessing. To be the image of God is to be a person of purpose with inherent dignity. We don't need to wake up every morning either to the question, who am I today? The framework is set. To the burden of self-identification every morning, what will I be today? We flourish when we live in harmony with our design and in submission to the creaturely limits God places on us. This is not bad news, it's good news. Which brings us to the counterbalancing thought. It is a limitation, but it's also a freedom. Note the syntax in verse 26. Let us make humankind in our image so that they may rule. They're given freedom within the limits of their overall purpose to bear the image of God creatively, uniquely, to express that image. And so, to make the point again, returning to the question of identity politics, issues of injustice, of oppression of the weak and marginalized are our issues too. They are integral to bearing the image of God. The image not only confers rights, but responsibilities. But here's the difference from our popular culture, the culture we inhabit. We do not make the fight against injustice the basis of who we are. Rather, it is the expression, the outworking of who we are and what we are. We do not fight injustice by identifying part identities within ourselves, weaponizing them as the foundation of all our identity, and then demanding others submit to it. That is not our way. We refuse such part identities, and instead fight injustice out of our true identity, our identity as children of God who bear his own image in Christ, male and female, and which trumps and relativizes all those part identities. Well, lots of questions, but we need to finish, and let me conclude by acknowledging that the work here has just begun. This is a framework. The writer in Genesis doesn't develop the text with a set of questions about gender dysphoria in front of him. He provides general principles for complex problems. But I want to suggest that today's identity politics not only offers a serious challenge, but a real opportunity for the thoughtful Christian academic to recognize good intentions of all sides of this debate, but to fight injustice alongside others as something that is integral to our image bearing, and with a Christian mind to offer something better. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and we've got some time for questions, I hope. Thank you.